1917 Russia is one of those times in history where we see multiple forces come together simultaneously and change the course of the world. And one of these forces is the Tsar of Russia himself, Nicholas II. He had just survived a failed revolution in 1905, and as a result, one of the concessions he made was to create a Duma for the Russian people to have some representation in the government. But in his October manifesto, he detailed that he would have veto power over the Duma and retain dictatorial control over the country, essentially nullifying any power the Duma might have had. And by the Third Duma, it's completely corrupt, with bourgeoisie, business owners, and wealthy landowners that are all in bed with the Romanov family anyway, so the people have absolutely no representation in the government at that point. One of the things that compound tragedy here is that the Tsar is trying to bring his country into the industrial age from an agricultural economy, and it's not going well. There's famine, the economy's in shambles after the loss of the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, and in 1914, to compound tragedy, World War I starts, and it brings Russia into the war with Germany. And it does not go well. Over the 3-year period from 1914 to the beginning of 1917, they lose 10 million people on the front. And the Tsar has had enough. The people have had enough. The Tsar makes a fatal error. He fires all the generals in 1916 that are on the front, goes to the front himself and takes command of the army. And because he has absolutely no military experience, he's not even a really good politician or a Tsar, and it goes poorly for him. They continue to lose, and protests and strikes begin to erupt in Petrograd, which is St. Petersburg. Well, he's recalled to Petrograd, and on his way there, on the train is stopped by the people, and he is arrested by his own army before he ever makes it back to the city. And that's where our revolutions in 1917 begin. So in February 1917, the Tsar has been arrested and put under house arrest, and the Provisional Government of Russia is created. The leader of this government's name is Alexander Kerensky, and Alexander Kerensky has an idea of where he wants to take the country, and he's going to base it generally on Karl Marx's book, Das Kapital. Now, I'm going to go a little bit into Marxism here, but I'll say up front that for the past 120 or so years, there have been so many interpretations of this book that there's almost no one defined interpretation. So no matter what I say next, there will be lots of people out there that disagree with this. But in general, Das Kapital talks about two classes of people, and there is a conflict between these two. The first class is your labor class or your worker class, who works hard for the business and makes the profit or the surplus value for the business. The second person in this conflict is the business owner, or in today's language, the corporation, the shareholders, who either don't work at all or work very little, but enjoy the profits, the surplus value of the labor that's done by their position, by owning the business. And this conflict needs to be resolved. And that's the whole, really the basis behind Das Kapital. So what Alexander Kerensky is going to do with Russia is he's going to move towards a socialist and eventually communist model, but he knows that he can't do this overnight. The third part of Karl Marx's book that gets very little attention states that there must be a transition period from a feudalistic society like they had in Russia to the communist society that is the workers' utopia that everybody strives for, everybody in that country. So what happens in between, though, is called a bourgeoisie capitalistic system. And so what Alexander Kerensky does when he takes over the provisional government in February of 1917 is he takes the people who were in the Duma, you remember them, and they're the bourgeoisie, landowners, business owners, and brings them into positions of power in the provincial government. Says, okay, we're going to have capitalism for a while as we transition to this other model. And with a wink and a nod, the bourgeoisies were like, sure, okay, because nothing has changed for them, and they have no intention of going over to this other model. But the arrest of the Tsar doesn't happen in a vacuum. Germany eventually finds out about it and takes full advantage of it because they're struggling in France. They buy a train ticket for Vladimir Lenin, who's in exile in Switzerland, and send him back to the capital, which is Petrograd at this time in Russia, and so that he can kind of go stir up trouble. Kind of keep the Russians off balance because they're still in a shooting war. Even though the Tsar has been arrested, there is no amnesty or peace with Germany. So Lenin gets to the train station, and he's written out his April notes. And he gets out and he starts talking about the Soviets and how all power to the Soviets, and the bourgeoisie do not represent the people, but the Soviets, who are worker leaders, very similar to the labor unions we have here in America. They're the leaders of the workers. The Soviets are more in tune with what the people want. So they should be the ones running the country, not the business owners. People love this message. And so April turns into May, turns into June, and they were still at war with Germany, and this is a real problem with a lot of the people, especially the army, because they've already lost millions of men on the German front. But what Alexander Kerensky does, he decides to honor the treaty with Serbia still, and he's already in with France and America and England, and continue the war with Germany. And they go on what's called the Kerensky Offensive in late June 1917, and it's met with disaster again. The Russian army is using old-style tactics with new-style weapons that Germany has, and they're getting murdered on the front. It's ugly. And this causes a protest in July called the July Days. And Lenin comes up, and he's, they're marching in the streets, and they're saying all power to the Soviets. And Alexander Kerensky, who had only been in power a few months now, sees that his power's about to be overthrown. And so he calls for the Pravda to be shut down. Pravda is the newspaper, translates to truth, ironically. Oh, and guess who's running Pravda at the time that it shut down? A man you might have heard of, his name is Stalin. And that's his piece in this part of history.